Well, welcome. Thanks for having me. This is my third time back to VLab, and it's always amazing. We can switch to my slides. To think about the convergence of, especially the community around here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and how we can rethink technology across many fields, including in healthcare. And of course, tonight we're going to talk about the applications of clinical trials and how that might be shifting. And they asked me to do about a little 8 to 10 minute sort of intro before we go into the panel to sort of set things up a little bit. So I'm trained at medical school here at Stanford. I did fellowships here in hematology, oncology, bone marrow transplantation, have been involved in many clinical trials. And what's interesting today is that there's a real opportunity to reshape and rethink clinical trials through this convergence of many fast-moving technologies. There's certainly a lot of challenges in how we move through the process. I mean, you could have the best invention, new drug, device, digiceutical, but unless you can get it through the FDA and regulatory process, it's a bit of a so what. So I think in part of our discussion, we'll kind of cross the spectrum from early stage to late stage to new ways of thinking about pop-up trials, virtual trials, and beyond. But my sort of setup, I want to sort of frame where we are. Medicine has not quite yet moved into the fourth industrial age, unlike many other fields. I think clinical trials is still stuck back here. A little bit, we're still using fax machines, including at Stanford in most places, to communicate, including clinical trial information. The well-known stats still often takes a decade for a drug to get through trials, half fail, huge costs and inefficiencies. So we have a real chance to rethink pharma, medical device, digital health. Pharmageddon is coming if companies and others don't adapt to some of these new changes. And we have a whole new set of exponential tools at our disposal. It's not just the usual trial in cancer, how many months does someone live? It can be their quality of life. We can look at new biomarkers from genome to proteome to microbiome to the integration of all this. Michelle coined the term digitome. We'll talk about that, the expression of all this digital exhaust that we can potentially use in new ways. And hopefully take what's often now very siloed data and connect it in real time to reshape everything across the healthcare spectrum, particularly in clinical trials, which are still based often on very intermittent, the nurse has to visit or the patient needs to go to the clinic. Again, only about 5% of Americans have access to being inside a clinical trial. In my world of pediatric oncology, almost every kid's in a trial, but in the adult world of oncology, it's far less than 10%. So we often get very intermittent episodic data. The potential, especially in trials and getting real-time information, is to take the scattered intermittent mode and move to this continuous one. In our connected digital age now, we can collect everything from our EKG to our sleep data and hopefully make that real time and think about even potentially real-time clinical trials where when you show up to the clinic and have a problem, we can take the crowdsourced information from the whole world and make sense of it. So one of the big themes I think of tonight is where do trials usually happen? Usually big academic centers like Stanford, UCSF. The trend with a lot of the new technologies and ability is to move healthcare and trials from the traditional four walls of the hospital, the clinic, to our home, to our phone, to on and even inside our bodies, and decentralize them. This is a great slide and post up by my friend Andrea Corvos, who's the founder of Electra Labs, about decentralized studies. You should see her post. I posted on Twitter today. The idea that we're moving from this traditional realm where data is entered by an intermediary, usually the nurse or the doc in the clinic, to moving it out into the virtual realm where things can be done in a blended way, and then all the way to a fully virtualized trial. And of course, you can't virtualize everything. You still sometimes need to do MRI scans and other elements that require a physical infrastructure. But there's a tremendous new ability, I think, to reinvent things. And there's a lot of energy, as we'll hear in the space. Some amazing new startups represented on the stage and in the community at large that are crossing that whole spectrum, from identifying and recruiting patients to managing operations to the logistics to how we collect, analyze the data, and really decentralize and virtualize trials. This is just a snapshot of many companies entering the space and attempting to be disruptive, even on top of the regulatory barriers. So of course we live here near Intel, where Moore's law was coined. Many technologies are moving quickly. What we used to do on computing on a desktop now fits on your smart watch, now fits on your smartphone, of course. The medicalized phone, of course, is a great laboratory for collecting all sorts of information, not just how much we're texting or tweeting, but our steps, what we're seeing, our emotional state. Clinical trials in mental health are moving to our phone. Lots of ability there with this amazing low-cost supercomputer that's in our pockets, in the pockets of most consumers and patients and trialists. And as the Apples and the Googles and the Samsungs and the Amazons are getting into the space, the fact that we're touching these devices 24/7 and can potentially even do an EKG or other data on them really opens up new ways of thinking and crowdsourcing that data. Internet of Things, of course, is already here. That's not just going to be riding 4G, but soon 5G, so the pipes are opening up. Lots of examples of things moving very quickly. The challenge, of course, is how do we connect the dots? There's this idea of course, connected, mobile, digital health that is essentially, I think, at the center of this new resurgence of how we can reshape clinical trials and take everything from simple vitals to imaging data to our environmental information and make sense of it in real time and hopefully really impact the future. So just a nudge here again is don't think about any one technology, think about how they're coming together, think about how they're converging, because it's at that convergence point that we have the real opportunity to reshape trials and beyond. And again, many companies are exponential companies leveraging these. They couldn't have even existed essentially 10 or 11 years ago. Our iPhones are really only 11 years old. And I want you to think also beyond the usual drug. We're in the era of electroceuticals, pacemakers not just for the heart, but for the brain, for the gut, for contraception. We're in the era of video games that are going through trials now for cognitive issues. And some of those are going to be approved soon. So prescribing a video game, how do we set up a trial around that? We're in the world of VR as therapeutics. Folks with chronic and acute pain going into virtually cold environments. How do you study and trial that and not do that in a 10-year blinded retrospective manner? Because the technology moves quicker. Physical therapy can be done in VR as well. Again, lots of challenges and opportunities to take what used to be video gaming technology and move it into the therapical realm. So I get a little chance to look at this convergence play. I chair medicine at Singularity University. I run a program called Exponential Medicine, which is coming up in November. And what's interesting about exponential medicine, just like this room here and our panelists, we come from all different worlds. And we think, how do we take these technologies and mix them up in new ways, from VR to 3D printing to just changing our mindset? This is the head of NHS innovation. I love the quote he likes to share. The difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones. And I think in healthcare broadly, we have a lot of old ideas that we're stuck with. We brought the head of digital health from the FDA to the last two Exponentials medicines, Bakul Patel, and had him exposed to some of the new thinking and technologies, and that's helped inform what the FDA has done. I think they're becoming quite forward-thinking and getting out of their linear mindset, and now you've probably heard about the FDA pre-cert program, some of the things we'll discuss tonight about software as a medical device and applying AI and regulating AI as a platform as well. So come join us November, lots of talks and other resources at exponentialmedicine.com as well. So what are some of the opportunities, real quickly, to expand? We have, of course, in the world of wearables, that's certainly become part of trials today, and they're going beyond the accelerometer on our wrist to sensors in our pills that can tell when a patient's taken the medication, track adherence. Digital tattoos can shrink what used to be millions of dollars worth of laboratory technologies. We can basically measure almost every element of physiology and behavior today. Our challenge and opportunity is to use that in smart ways in healthcare and in trials. We're moving from this data siloed on our smartphones and our wearables, quantified self, to quantified health, and to really hopefully have a continual flow of this information to the trialist, to a clinician, to pharma, to continually hone the razor for both prevention, diagnostics, and therapy. And we can measure all sorts of new things. Here's a startup called ShapeScale. I can not just check my weight, I can get my shape, my fat content, my muscle content. That could certainly inform how you might dose an individual on a new drug or therapy as opposed to the usual one-size-fits-all. Common issues like hypertension can move from our wrist-based blood pressure devices to some startups that are developing ways to do that seamlessly. So we'll have a whole new set of digital exhaust and tools to work with in our digitome. We can measure tremor in a patient using a simple wearable and potentially do a trial or also modify their therapy. We might draw blood now in new ways without having to require a phlebotomist. There's several companies developing technologies in those realms. So all this can empower each of us to be included in trials, to volunteer our data, to be data donors, to be empowered to use this, combining information now with our mobile phones, with our health record at Stanford. I can now get my medical record from Stanford and share my digital data with my doc, so that's relatively new. We're starting to understand what this data might mean, this new realm. We don't know what digital exhaust means. We're not just, again, measuring months of life. We need to understand the digital footprints. The All of Us trial launched last month out of the NIH, which will be a Framingham trial on steroids for about 1 million individuals. So essentially a clinical trial at large to understand disease across different spectrums. And of course, we have other exponentials at play. Genomics is getting cheap. Almost every drug may be impacted by pharmacogenomics. Do I need normal dose, low dose, high dose, or another drug altogether? How do we integrate low-cost genomics into the future of drugs and beyond? How do we take diseases and start to subset them beyond thinking about just type 2 diabetes? This is AI, machine learning applied to analyzing several thousand type 2 diabetics, and there are at least 3 distinct subtypes. So as we subset diseases at the molecular and other levels, we can, I think, rethink trials on those realms as well. Microbiome information, how your microbiome impacts how drugs work, lots of new issues coming to the fore. And as we move forward, we can have, we have incredible new ways of imaging. This is my brain. I can look at my brain and predict my risk for disease or how I might respond to therapy. We can, of course, no doubt point of care lab testing coming to our home and our phone despite the Theranos disaster. Lots of things coming together. The digital doctor's bag is going to be the digital clinical trials bag. Everything from doing a retinal scan to tracking almost every other vital sign and beyond. So really lots of new tools at our disposal. I'm just, you've seen many of these examples from the EKG that I already have in my watch from AliveCor, a company doing trials on this, already doing over 1 million EKGs a month, to the point where they are now able to use this not just to look for AFib, but to look at potassium levels. So new ways of collecting data in really exciting ways are going to inform lots of clinical trials. Let me just probably skip to the end here. Part of it is connecting the dots. Whether you're a trialist, a patient, a clinician, a pharma company, how do you make sense of this explosion of data is still a huge challenge. How do you create user interfaces that make it easy to not just look at the data, but get the actionable information to inform the clinician or anyone designing a trial and getting it to market? How do we take new forms of information from a retinal scan and apply machine learning to predict disease or hopefully prevent it? And how do you regulate that? Still big questions there, particularly as machine learning can already do a better job than Stanford radiologists. So I'm out of time here. I just want to mention that, of course, none of these things replace, AI doesn't replace the doctor or the nurse or the clinical trial. We need to blend these things together as we move forward. So let me sort of cut to the end here because we won't have time for everything else. And just mention that we're in a pretty interesting new age of personalization. I have a TED Talk coming out on Thursday about a new technology I'm developing to 3D print drugs. So maybe we'll literally be modifying our drugs and printing their combination every day. How do you trial that? But we are in an age where we all have the opportunity to reinvent clinical trials. You can already download trials on your mobile phone through Apple Health Kit, so I encourage you all to start trying this yourself and informing the community and the next generation. We can think hopefully about the future of medicine and trials as all being data donors, where just like we can't drive without Google Maps or Waze, we'll be crowdsourcing the future of medicine in these new ways as well, with privacy left intact. And I think as we look forward, we can all become, again, not organ and blood donors, but data donors, and use this convergence of technologies in new ways to rethink and reimagine clinical trials. So that's our opportunity. We're going to talk about a lot of that tonight in different realms. And thanks for your time and attention. And let's move it over to hearing from Wout, founder of Deep6, who's going to tell us about what he's doing as an example of a great new company in the space.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Wout. I am the CEO and founder of Deep6 AI. And it's my pleasure and honor to be here tonight. To be honest, I'm actually surprised to see this many people listening to a talk about clinical trials. When we started doing this about 2.5 years ago, we had to explain the reason for clinical trials to most people. When we spoke to early investors, so why clinical trials? What's the whole point? Today we're getting calls from investors like, listen, Wout, we have a thesis on clinical trials. Could you please listen to us and talk about that? So a lot have changed in the mere 2.5 years since we've been doing this. A little bit about us. We started, believe it or not, in a completely different industry in the US intelligence space. We did some kind of a contest where we beat out another couple of big companies, started there, decided to change our lives for the better. We did this before the current administration came into power, so I'm not going to say we were pre-signed, but we got out just in time. We then actually participated in a Techstars accelerator in Los Angeles, which was specifically focused on healthcare. And at the time, what we really did is we were basically a solution looking for the right problem to solve. We all had an interest as a team in healthcare. During this accelerator, we interviewed and spoke with close to 500 different physicians, nurses, researchers, payers, hospital executives, etc., the whole gamut. And for a while, we started diligently listening to their problems and making like a stack chart. What is the problem that we should really do? What is the biggest impact, etc. But what we learned after a while is basically there's so many problems in healthcare. And yes, you can play in the margins. But to some extent, every healthcare professional we spoke to, they were all what we called frustrated innovators. They all knew what was wrong with healthcare. They all knew how they could actually improve stuff. The strange thing that united all of them is like, well, if I could have the time or the money to do a clinical trial, I could show that this worked and I could take this new solution to market. So what we learned is there's a thing called clinical trials, which were both a gatekeeper, but also some kind of a bottleneck to bringing innovation to healthcare. Because as you know, since you're all here, every new drug, device, treatment procedure has to be tested on real patients to show that it's safe and that it works. So that's that whole clinical trials aspect. So we decided, well, if we really want to be systemic and be holistic in our approach, can we somehow address the inefficiencies in clinical trials and try to accelerate innovation in healthcare as a whole, rather than focus on a couple of localized and targeted solutions? So that's kind of what we did. Some of these statistics are probably pretty well known. I'm going to dwell too much on it. The key problem that we saw is that in recent years, we've been trying to recruit over 6 million patients into clinical trials each year. In reality, we only managed to enroll around 2 million, so less than 40% of the patients that we need to get. So you can imagine what the impact is, right? Ruchita, you probably know this more than I do, but this affects millions of lives. Patients waiting for new drugs to come to market that could save their life and improve their quality of life, right? It costs industry billions of dollars. And it plays a non-negligible role in increasing drug prices as they go up. So why do we think that we could play here? Daniel mentioned the whole datafication issues. He mentioned all the new ways in which we're capturing new healthcare data through sensors and other devices, et cetera. Now, what we believe our strength is, because very frankly, we call ourselves the village idiots of healthcare at the start, because we felt like we have to figure all of this out, but we really understood data. And we understood how different types of structured and unstructured data can be blended together, and how you can turn all of these disparate data fields with completely different metrics that they're tracking. How can you blend this into one system that can become a reliable sofa, right, and a subject of analysis? So how can you create that? So what we did is we started looking at clinical data and realized the structured data that is being captured in the typical fields in EMRs and by machines is very limited. What happens most of the time is that when a physician sees a patient, they try to maintain some kind of eye contact, and they try to talk to you, and they try to solicit facts from you, and they're really talking. While they're doing that, if they would have to chase down a drop-down box and try to enter data here, so this is the diagnosis, this is the medication, this is the symptom, it would break that whole flow. Instead, what most physicians do, and I'm sure there's quite a few here, they enter all of that in the unstructured data fields. They type in notes, and there's a lot of stuff in there. Traditional software cannot deal with this, so they only offer a limited field. However, if you use different types of NLP and machine learning, et cetera, you can start looking at all those notes, and you can build a much richer view of a patient. You can go beyond that limited red dots, and you can basically turn patient data that exists in EMRs, that exist in different PACS systems, LIS, genomic databases, et cetera. You can unify all of that into one unified view of a patient. We call that a rich clinical vector, or a multidimensional clinical vector, right, that has all those different data points from all the different sensors. And it gives you some kind of a 360-degree view of the patient. Now, you can do many things with that, but since we're talking about clinical trials, an easy fix there is you can basically apply this to the eligibility criteria for trials and match that against eligibility, inclusion, and exclusion criteria. What this really allows you to do is look at massive amounts of patients and in mere seconds find all the patients that are eligible for a specific trial. Or you can do the inverse. You can start from a patient who's looking for treatment, say like these are all the trials that you're actually eligible for and that can have beneficial outcomes to you. Rather than most of the wizard approaches where you kind of have to have patients go through hundreds of trials and then select and share some data about their condition, and hopefully it'll result in 40 trials that they still have to manually read through. You can really limit it down to only those trials they're eligible for, and it could have some impact. So that's kind of what we're doing. When we tried this live, we did a couple of case studies with Cedars-Sinai, which is a big academic medical center in Los Angeles, and we had really good results from day one. One of the big validations was a study with a biomarker PI. She'd been trying to find patients for a non-small cell lung cancer biomarker study. And something that really validated our approach is that when you're trying to search for non-small cell lung cancer in an EMR, when you try to search the structured fields that are like the diagnostic codes and the problem lists, they will basically designate a patient as lung cancer patient, lung cancer of the left lung, metastatic lung cancer, these kind of things. They will use ICD-9 or ICD-10 codes. They will not mention that it's lung cancer, it's non-small cell. For that, it's typically information you will find in the pathology report or that you will find in the physician notes. So we were able to find 58 patients for that PI in 8 minutes after she searched with our tool. where she had only been able to find 23 in the previous 12 months. So it was kind of a game changer that showed that we were really onto something. We then deployed it, and we actually expanded it beyond just oncology and other trials. And this was a more recent study, where when we met with the researchers who were doing this cardio study, they had been able to recruit, well, it's maybe a strong word saying able to recruit. They basically had 2 patients recruited in 6 months' time, and both of them were walk-in patients. As we were training them on our software, they found 19 patients in their data set, right? I think in less than an hour. They then validated it down to 16. 3 had some other indications that didn't make them good subjects. 3 weeks later, they had 8 patients on the study. So you can really see how that condensing the time to find patients also actually helps you recruit them faster and focus your efforts on that. So it was a good success. So how does it work for us? What is kind of our goal? We were talking about working with health systems. If you look at the ecosystem for clinical trials, what we try to do is make the data, again, the connective tissue for all the stakeholders within this ecosystem. So obviously, there's the hospitals that have the data and the patients. They're really helping executing the clinical trials to the patients, right? There's the pharma companies like Sanofi and Novartis that are sponsoring the research, right, and trying to find the sites and the hospitals with the patients. They also employ CROs as subcontractors. There's patients themselves. Today, we are really focusing mostly on hospitals and pharma companies. It's a bandwidth issue. We are too small to become a B2C company and reach out to patients directly. It's something we may do in the future or through partnerships. But there's also a fourth stakeholder, and those are payers. We're very interested in reaching out to them today because we feel by partnering up with payers, we can actually tap into their patients on their plans, get much more people interested and exposed to trials, expand access to those people to cutting-edge treatments, and also basically unburden some of the cost for the payers and maybe shift them to sponsors. Sorry, guys, that's you. When we talk about the value proposition across research, I'm trying to go through this fairly quickly here. This is kind of the linear view of clinical trials as you have it today. It starts with trial design, right? You're trying to say this is what the trial should do, these are the endpoints, these are the kind of patients we're looking for. Then you go into site selection, you say these are the sites where I think I'll find patients. Then you start recruiting the patients, then you do the on-study management and monitoring, and then there's the post-study stuff. Do I have that right, Ruchita? Because I'm the village idiot, as you know. So we start from patient recruitment. And now for us as a company that's really focused on data and really focused on AI, it was kind of an existential question. Do we really dig deeper on this? Is this where we really play and can perfect our AI, kind of shave off seconds if we even bring it down to minutes? Is that really what moves the needle? Not as much. And what we're really doing now is we're focusing more and more upstream and downstream, because shaving off more seconds of minutes has negligible impact, right? If we can say, if we can use the same data model and maybe partner with organizations like Medable and others, right? And say now, we have a strong data model, we can use this to help with site selection. Can we now also change the paradigm by which you have to start from a protocol, then find sites, and then start recruitment? What if we actually start from the patients? We know they're there, we know that they meet these conditions. Can we do what we call a pop-up trial? Like you have a restaurant that goes, hey, today I'm going to have my restaurant here, people come over, eat, etc. Do the same thing with a clinical trial. So really thinking, today it takes many months to onboard sites. Can we kind of condense that as well? If we do that, we probably have a bigger impact on the whole value chain than just keep on pushing the AI and patient recruitment. Which is important for us because it means, in a good way, we're becoming more and more of a product company and less of just an AI company, which is exciting as well. And it changes our team makeup and everything else. We can also push further to trial design and also actually go further downstream into the on-study monitoring and actually use the outcomes that we are monitoring from the studies, both the ones that make it back into the EMR, where you have like the clinical outcomes, like how's the patient doing, what are the values that they're seeing, etc., but also the research outcomes that are being stored in separate databases. Typically, those don't talk to each other. The fact that we have this graph data model, right, where every data point can talk to each other, makes it easy to, again, have that 360-degree view of a patient and bring all that data together and see, well, if we know that some of these patients on a trial are exceptional responders, they respond so much better than the average patient on this trial, right? We find 5 of, say, 75 patients that are exceptional responders. Now we have 7 patients that are poor responders. Can we use that graph that has a very broad and granular picture of a patient to see what is it in the graph of those 5 patients that are exceptional responders that they all have in common, but it sets them apart from all the other patients on the study, right? Can we find micro cohorts of exceptional responders and then basically try to say, let's find more patients like this and find fewer patients that are poor responders. So you can have that adaptive trial design that makes it actually, so you move away from this linear process and you try to connect everything and make it much more proactive. And what we believe will happen eventually, let me actually jump ahead, is that instead of this linear process that you see here, you'll have something much more like this, where all of these phases can kind of intermix, and you can go back and you can reinforce them. You can use the data that you grab from one stage to actually build and help design the next stage. And you can also share data across trials and kind of say, since you already have these endpoints, can I create some of these virtual avatars and some of these virtual data points to infuse the data that I have today and have a richer model? So we believe some of the things that we hope to see and hope to help work on are those adaptive trial designs. Not just do this with a lot of manual effort and say like, oh, I'm doing an adaptive trial, but no, this should become standard. The data, the outcomes that you have from a trial should go back and infuse and inform everything you're doing from day one. Another thing we talked about was those pop-up trials. Hey, if I know that you have patients, instead of, what is the thing they say in finance? Past performance is no indication of future success or something. Today, most sites go there because you happen to know somebody and you had success in the past. No, if you start from, I have these patients here today, I monitor them, let's start a trial and let's do this. You can, again, do this way faster. Other things is, I mean, you've heard about other companies doing remote and siteless trials. I think that there will still be some kind of a teetering to a site because you just have the expertise. They can help curate. They can help actually manage the experience for patients as well. But I believe tying all of this together, you can become far less dependent on the site. You can use remote centers and patient-reported outcomes and everything to kind of connect them and have them more remote and still capture them and bring them in only when you need it to reduce the burden for patients. Other things are these, what actually did I put there? Oh yeah, trials and treatments will converge. I believe that eventually, since you have all of this data and this data will blend, there will be something like a collective medical intelligence, where every time you see a physician, every time you use a device, like Daniel was saying, everything gets monitored, right? Everything is datafied, and it comes all together. Whenever a patient is seen by a physician, he could say, well, you know what? Your graph looks like these 500 other patients like you, and since I've seen them 6 months ago, 2 years ago, I can kind of have a crystal ball to say this is likely what will happen. You have a distribution of outcomes and of things based on the specificity of your data graph, and then you can take that forward. Other things that I think will be even a step further actually is from this collective medical intelligence, you can build on that. You can basically build patient avatars and make predictions on that. So you can have your actual patient, and then you can, your profile based on the data that you have there, turn this into an avatar and start actually doing predictive and fuzzy matching about how could this actually evolve in the future. What are my different solution spaces that could actually have like some kind of distribution in the future of what will happen to me if this or this were to happen, which is a cool way forward. But I think we're going to talk more about that after this in the panel. So that's it from me, folks. Thank you.
Thanks, Wout. So our next panelist is Michelle Longmire. Met her a couple years ago and was blown away by what she's doing with her company Medable, which she'll share with us right now.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. Let me just see about I have 2 slides, and I only have 2 minutes. And following Wout is never fun because he's got this great accent and he's wicked smart. But the cool thing is that all of us on the stage actually work together. And it's really an honor to be here tonight, so thank you to V Labs. The last time I was in this room was in my residency graduation from dermatology at Stanford. So it's cool to be back here and thinking about if they'd known what I was going to do, they may have been a little bit surprised about where my research career was going because it wasn't in the direction anyone anticipated. So I'm the CEO and founder of Medable. I'm a physician by training. I trained here at Stanford in dermatology. And really the kind of inspiration for my company really came from the work that I did here, where I was looking at autoimmune disease in identical twins. And I was looking at the expressed genome in a rare disease in identical twins. And it really put me front and center with the challenges of clinical research, which is it's really hard to find patients, especially when you're looking at rare disease and then the rarest, the identical twins with those diseases. And really this emerging field of big data. So when you think about where we're going from a diagnostics, from a personalized medicine perspective, you've got the microbiome, you've got the epigenome, we've got more and more individualized therapies, and a lot of the work that needs to be done will both be a convergence of our ability to accurately find and at scale find patients who are applicable, a lot of the work like Deep 6 is doing, and also the ability to derive insights around this massive contextual data, something our company calls the digitome, which is this digital representation of our lives, everything from our genome to our environmental data to our contextual data about how we're living, what medicines we're taking, and how we're thriving. So Medable, short and simple, really aims to provide the technology solution to bring this type of research to the world. So our platform is accessible to investigator-led studies and is used by some of the leading academic medical centers and research institutions. It's also used by biopharma companies, biotechnology companies, and CROs, or clinical research organizations, and it really does 6 core things. It enables us to capture data from patients at scale with connected devices and in the real-world setting. It enables us to capture data from clinical sites or clinical clinics. It enables us to aggregate that data, provide integrations with additional data sets like claims data. It enables us to provide role-based access so that your doctor can see a certain view, a biotech company can see a certain view, us at Medable can see a certain view, and patients can see a certain view. And it provides the actual tools to analyze and develop algorithms about this data. So an example is, if we're studying lupus and we don't know what is it that's causing a disease flare, but we have massive amounts of data that are genomic data, therapeutic data, in weather data or environmental data, perhaps we can find a new signal about what it is that's driving a lupus flare or a response to therapy. And then we aggregate this data in something that is kind of a first of its type consortium we call the Digitome. So this is aimed to be a first of its kind network of data across all of the studies. So it's a big vision, and we've had a ton of fun doing it. I'm joined by my colleagues at Medable today, and I always say really our company is where we are because we have, I think, the team of the most inspired, smartest, and incredible people that don't include myself, but I've recruited them somehow. And we're enabling research really kind of anytime, anywhere. So if you want to learn more about what we're doing, please, I'm trying to advance my slide, but it may not happen. Please find us. We're wearing gray sweatshirts. It says Medable. Excited to talk with you about your research ideas, your vision for clinical trials of the future, for this concept of the Digitome, and super excited to be here tonight with all my friends in clinical trials. So thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. We're going to hear from Mo Force, who's the global head of BIOME out of Novartis Pharmaceuticals.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me from VLab to invite me today. I'm the co-founder and the head of BIOME, so not the microbiome, the real BIOME. So we are the newly neighbor in town. So we just opened actually on the 8th of December in San Francisco, downtown. We are the Digital Innovation Lab by Novartis, which is externally branded, the first externally branded innovation hub, which is built to actually connect between Novartis and the whole ecosystem of digital health. Our focus is how can we be the bridge between the whole ecosystem, from a startup, from venture capital, from universities, academia, and anyone with an idea, and the pharma company, which is Novartis in this case, to find and create new solutions that actually make sense for patients, which is a key focus for us. In my previous role, I'm a pharmacist as background, and in my previous role, I was in ophthalmology franchise. I was leading the effort to build something called Focal View, which is the first Apple research kit for visual impairment and ophthalmology as a whole. So I was working with Apple to build the technology, which it was very new in the ophthalmology field, and this concept of the decentralized clinical trial, virtual clinical trial, whatever you would like to call it, empowering patients to lead his own personal clinical trial.
Sinha was the Senior Director of Investments at Sanofi Ventures.
Hey, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. So the beauty of being the last in the line is everyone's pretty much said what I had to say. So I'll just tell you a little bit about me and our fund and why we think clinical trials are an interesting area from an investor perspective. So Sanofi Ventures is a corporate fund, which essentially means we manage Sanofi's money. Sanofi is one of the largest, like Novartis, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And we, as a fund, we are currently investing out of a second fund, which is $330 million. We're a global fund. We invest in the US, in Europe, and in China. And we invest in both biotech and digital health opportunities. I lead the digital health investing arm. And on the therapeutic side, or the biotech side, we invest in anything pretty much across all therapeutic areas, rare genetic diseases, immunology, oncology, neurodegenerative diseases across the board. And on the digital health side, we invest in anything that has an application on the pharma value chain. So if you think about AI technologies impacting R&D, we're interested in that. Obviously, clinical trials is a huge area of focus for us. Biopharma manufacturing, things like synthetic biology are an area of interest for us. Anything on the patient engagement, chronic disease management side is of interest for us. Real-world evidence, digital therapeutics, so all of those platforms are of interest for us. In the clinical trial space, we have made a number of investments, and our parent organization is partnering with a number of companies. So our investments in the space are in Science 37, which Novartis is a co-investor in as well. And Science 37 is one of the companies pioneering the concept of siteless trials, which means that you don't need patients to come into a clinical trial site. You can actually keep the patient at the home and use telemedicine and nurses to do what's required, to measure endpoints or to deliver the drug. And then the second investment we have in the space is Evidation Health, which uses behavioral and environmental data to build biomarkers of disease, and they call that digital biomarkers. So those are the two investments we have. And then our parent organization is also working with companies like Deep6, who you heard about, as well as a company called Trinetics, which plays way at the beginning of the clinical trial value chain that you saw right in the protocol development. So they're actually using EMR and patient data to develop better protocols and refine endpoints for pharma companies. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. So I thought we'd start, we're gonna do about 25 minutes of questions from me and the panel back and forth, and we'll open up to you, and there'll be a phone number showing up here that you can text your questions to, and they'll show up magically on the iPad. So we'll start on that section in about 20, 25 minutes. So I thought we'd start back at the beginning, which is the big challenge you mentioned briefly, patient sourcing, and maybe even identifying the right patients for trials, given that we need to move from our one-size-fits-all, and many trials are very limited, and the patients who end up in them are not really even valid for the general population. So I thought I'd sort of open up to the panel and ask, what kind of insights do you have on how to identify, validate, and change the mode of getting folks into trials, even in the immunotherapy area, which is exploding. There's a shortage of patients overall. So any comments on sourcing?
Sure. I mean, there's two ways that you source patients, right? I mean, realistically, either you start from a trial, you try to find patients for them, or you do it the other way around. You start from a patient, say which are the trials you can basically recommend. I think you have to work on both sides to make something happen. A lot of approaches start typically, or most patients that do enroll in a trial start from their physician, because it's a trusted person, and they feel like, hey, this person knows what's in my best interest. And most patients don't really know about trials. The inverse, and something that we're promoting now as well, because we believe it has more scale, is starting from a trial, saying these are all the patients in my population or my database that may be a good match, right? And then reaching out, which means you can actually do that at scale and condense the time frame more. And I believe both of them have to go hand in hand. Our technology is really focusing on that part, and we're trying to really identify patients. Like you said, clinical trial criteria are becoming more and more precise. If you look at a typical protocol from, say, 10 years ago, you had maybe 7 or 8 criteria. If you look at the average protocol today, like what, 30, 35, it's crazy. I heard somebody actually call this like the Christmas tree paradigm. Each year that you actually build your Christmas tree, you put on all the stuff you bought in previous years, then you add a couple of new things, and next year the same thing, you never throw it away. So it gets more and more complex and bloated. It means it's harder to find patients, right? So that's where data comes in, where data can really help and be very specific. Then with the adaptive trials, then you can kind of tailor it. It's like which patients are actually responding well, and hopefully you can get rid of some of those criteria again. So that's our view on this, basically.
And it's been mentioned a couple times. Not everyone here knows what an adaptive clinical trial is. Can you summarize that quickly? What's an adaptive clinical trial?
Sure, which is basically, rather than starting on day one, select these are the criteria for my trial, and now I'm going to find those patients, and all the way to them, I'm going to stick to this. You adapt the criteria to your trial to the findings, the outcomes that patients produce on the trial. So basically, if you see that these patients are doing better on the trial, so this 10% of my patients are doing really well, let's see if I can find more, if I can adapt the criteria of my trial to find more of those patients and fewer of the others. What that allows you to do is, since you have better response, you get faster approval from the FDA, and you have more targeted prescriptions for your treatment.
Right, you can get there faster and fewer patients, and I think it was pioneered by like Laura Esserman at UCSF with the I-SPY
exactly,
trial.
the I-SPY trial, yeah.
A lot of that work's been done locally, and it's changing the paradigm.
Yep.
So just to build on his point, I think he clearly described it as two sides, and I think of it as a pull and the push, right? So I think he talked more about the push, which you have the clinical trial sites think about all the eligible patients, and then you go reach, and even that is super inefficient, which is why we need technologies like Deep 6. The flip side of it is the pull, which means you educate patients about trials, and then you let them come to you. And so a lot of folks these days are trying to use social media or different types of outreach to patients to educate them about trials. You can use platforms like Foundation Medicine and the genomic tests as a platform as well to educate patients every time they get a test. So there are kind of two separate categories of companies that are tackling each one, but clearly a lot of them are playing out and dramatically improving the recruitment.
Just one thing to that point, because I think you have to do both, and we do both as well. The big problem that I see with a lot of companies that are trying to do or that use social media to attract patients, if you do it that right, you don't know whether your patient's even eligible for the trial you're trying to recruit it for. We were at South by Southwest 2 years ago, and it was a great experience for us. I mean, we won the award, and we met with Vice President Joe Biden. It was like, oh, great. But then after we had a conversation on stage, and I walked off, there was actually a woman who came to me, and she was a cancer survivor. She had stage 3 metastatic breast cancer. And she told me, what I really like is what you're doing is you're helping patients like me, if I see this correct, right? Go through all the BS around trials. If she goes to cancer.gov or to clinicaltrials.gov and she types, I'm BRCA1 positive, I have these phenotypical expressions, this and this, find me trials, I get a list of 140 trials that I'm potentially eligible for. For her to weed through 140 trials, reach out to trial coordinators, 3 weeks later getting an email, doing an online survey, doing this and that, it's hell. She doesn't have that time. And it's just, you need to be smart, you need to use data. So the other thing is, even when you start from a patient to recommend eligible trials, you have to say what is specific about this patient, what are the 2 or 3 trials that are really the best for you. Not, these are 140 trials that you may be interested in, go and figure it out.
Now, with your platform or others, is there yet a way where I can enter my genome, my medical condition or conditions, and get an alert pop up, say there's a trial available for you now?
Well, yes, I mean, that's what we don't have that to patients. We do have that today if you're at a site where we're deployed. If a patient comes in, if in real time something happens, say a new Foundation Medicine report comes in or something, or a Caris report, and you have like a tumor sample has been taken, or a pathology report, and they found, say, some genetic mutation. If that's new, and then suddenly you'll become eligible for a specific trial, in real time we will flag that, but today we'll send it to your physician. We will not send it to the patient, because again, we don't have access to the patient directly, plus there's privacy, etc. But the physician will get it in real time. The next time he opens a record, there'll be a flag, oh, do you know that now patient John Smith is eligible for this trial? And the researcher who's on the trial will get it as well, so it works from both sides.
And I would argue we need to start educating the clinicians out there. The physicians who are not in academic centers are 98%,
Absolutely.
90%, and most aren't in academic ivory towers and want to potentially stay involved academically. So Michelle, you've been sort of democratizing trials outside of the 4 walls of the normal Stanford and UCSF. What have you seen in both recruiting docs and patients into this realm?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I trained at Stanford and we're obviously a leader in clinical research, but I still think the whole aspect of clinical trials as a care option, even in the best research settings, is really lacking. So it'd be interesting to see a raise of hands, and probably not many people who the conversation may be relevant, but physicians don't really think to bring this up to patients, even those who are eligible, aside from the pediatric population. So I think the opportunity to really change the way in which physicians think about clinical trials and then enable patients who are eligible to be aware is massive, because it is just not being done. And so, I think when I think about it, and our company is working on this, we provide this platform for research, and we're seeing a lot of open opportunities in the clinical workflow to really think about how, one, you could use a technology like Deep 6 or others to identify a patient, but then get that patient screened and enrolled then and there. And so, yeah, I think that right now it's not a part of the workflow is one of the big problems for physicians. And then for patients, they're really unaware of that as an option for their treatment when they're encountering, what is the next thing, and maybe there's not something conventional that's the right fit.
And you mentioned workflow. I mean, everyone's overwhelmed with click boxes and feeding the EMR.
Right.
So the future should be that when you've got a patient in the clinic and I'm seeing Michelle and you've got an issue, it might give me the push and alert saying, did you
Right.
know she's eligible for this trial?
Yeah, so some of the work we're doing is exactly looking at that. So, when a patient becomes eligible, that just like now you're able to surface a digital solution in the EMR, you're able to now surface an application that they can then go home with on their phone that's going to actually be a direct-to-patient clinical trial. So we're actually doing that work because, as a practicing physician myself, I think a big part of the barrier is truly the workflow and where does this come into play in a standard clinical encounter. So I think ironing that out seems simple, but it has huge value.
There's one point maybe I would like to comment, which is looking from a global point of view, because big part of the issue, I think, and actually most of the conversation is focusing on the US market. And definitely US market, you have like all of those data sets and all of those clinicaltrial.gov and all of the, let's say, the databases, which it would be easier for US market to allow this push, like the pop-up of like, okay, you are eligible for this clinical trial. But if you look at the whole global market and those type of data and those type of genetic data and all of those type of reports is not available in most of the countries. And I think with the whole, I will go back to your point that I think the key part is educating patients at the end of the day. Is like, how can we increase the awareness about why we are doing clinical trials is exactly the point that people don't know today. And most of the case, when you go to even Stanford here and as a personal experience, they will tell you like, okay, there's a clinical trial, you want to join, and you are fitting in this one. But for me, and I'm a pharmacist, and my wife is pharmacist, we're afraid to join because we have no idea how far it can go. So I think there's a big part of like increasing awareness and allowing some platform, like for example, Apple Research Kit, or in the future, it will be even much more than this, is helping patients opt in a clinical trial because they believe. And in the first announcement of Apple Research Kit, when they created this one, there was a patient which she was talking about like, I'm joining this experience because I want to tell my my grandsons that actually I was part of changing this disease. I think this part of like empowering patient to understand what is the clinical trial, why he's joining it, and at the same time that he can opt in a clinical trial, and even if he's, by the way, not eligible, the part of like, because maybe in the future there will be like maybe 100 or 200 apps for clinical trials. So yes, he will not be eligible for 5, 10, but at least he will be eligible for some of them. And I think in the future, with all of those new wearables, like something like the new Apple Watch or all of them, Apple Watch itself is just the start of like many more real medical devices coming as wearables. With those, actually all of those systems will start to speak to each other, that it will start pushing in the Apple Store or Android market or maybe the future platform, some clinical trials that are eligible for you. So it will, the whole idea of the platform of like DeepSix, that it will be a little bit much more. So maybe your next platform is how can you jump in the Apple Store, analyzing them, and start to push data for patient directly. That, it's the same like with your search. And instead of the regional search, your search was like, if I'm eligible or not. And the system will automatically suggest for you apps. But I think the key is what you're highlighting is really empowering patient to understand why he's participating and what is the value of his data that he's actually kind of donating.
Yeah, I agree with you, but also I think it's a dance, right? So you got to do the patient and the physician, because we have had experience with a portfolio company that did a trial where they went overboard maybe, but they went out and educated patients, and they got a lot of patients coming into the funnel, but then you realize patients don't necessarily know what their conditions are a lot of the times, or what types of medications they take. So I think educating patients is good, but you got to make the connection to the physician as well, because ultimately the physician knows whether the patient is likely to be eligible, what type of indication the patient has, what the diagnosis is, what types of medications they are on. The patient doesn't necessarily have the full picture. The average patient, I mean, there are always patients who just are completely up with it, but the average patient doesn't have the full picture.
And just like, a lot of misaligned incentives in healthcare, you need to think about aligning incentives for patients and clinicians to get involved. And I used the example of Google Maps. We all donate some pretty private data, our speed and location, we get a map of traffic. Now, we couldn't imagine driving without that. Same thing might go when you're joining a trial, you want to feel that you're going to get potentially some feedback back. Many folks are very altruistic, want to help, but it's going to be more imperative to give that closed loop element as we go forward. So a couple things we mentioned a couple times, this word pop-up trial. Maybe let's dive into what this now virtual trial might be evolving to, and also maybe some surprising things that are going beyond the traditional pill, because we always used to think about, okay, there's new drug A, drug B, arm A, arm B. Maybe what are some of the things you're seeing that are a little interesting, and some of the formations of a pop-up realm?
Yeah, sure. And pop-up trial, honestly, I mean, is a term I came up with a couple of weeks ago when I was sitting in a meeting, like, hey, it sounds cool and it works. But so there are other names that are maybe more precise, but the way I saw this was really what I was talking about before, right? You can work on patient recruitment, et cetera. You can work on other things, or you can say like, hey, if we've condensed this down to this, what is the next step? Where is the other big bottleneck? And that is really in onboarding sites. On average, I think today it takes between 6 and 7 months to actually onboard a new site onto a clinical trial, which is crazy, because all that really happens is you agree on a budget, you agree on an IRB, you agree on a protocol, right, and on the regulatory stuff. It's not rocket science. You should be able to do all of that. So the concept that we had, or that we're thinking about, and it kind of piggybacks on some of the other concepts of remote trials, et cetera, is if you start from the fact that I know these sites have these patients, I know this is kind of my trial design and my indication, can I run a query against all of the population, kind of see where these patients live at specific sites or even specific physicians, and say, you know what, you have 3 patients that would be awesome for this trial, completely eligible. Why don't we start having a trial here? And I see that either your PI or a colleague has extensive experience, or we can ship part of a trial in the box, and maybe that's part of what you do in a way, right? We can give you the tools to be efficient and to ramp up quickly onto a trial, but instead of taking 7 months, we can do this in 30 days or eventually 10 days. And you start immediately, and you get the help either in a digital format or maybe even boots on the ground to some extent to be successful and finalize this quickly. And again, that's then part of an adaptive stuff where you learn and you feed each other knowledge.
Yes, I think the concept of the pop-up trial, I love that Wout's thinking that. I mean, I think it's a powerful one. I'd say some of the other things that we're seeing that are really interesting are how digital really opens a door to personalized medicine. So, you know, I think when we look at gene therapy, you're looking at really small populations of people all over the world. So, you know, how are you going to find someone with a rare gene variant who might really be the critical population to showing that this gene therapy works when you're maybe trying to find 600 people in every 50,000 or even fewer? So some of what we're seeing is really exciting is the way in which we can leverage digital and essentially targeted recruitment to find people and screen them in very large numbers. And I think what's exciting about that is you imagine if you screen 50,000 people, you don't then just want to only do this study on the 600 who are eligible, but you really want to think about a bigger community of patients who can be a part of a bigger study while in parallel doing this targeted personalized medicine study. So thinking more about massive screening for personalized medicine, building databases, communities, next generation registries from those patients, and then also taking this, you know, gene therapy or personalized medicine screening to the next level, you know, actually sending that person to their home a cheek swab so they can self-screen and do a gene assay on their own. And these are things we're actually doing, and I think what I've realized is that without technologies like ours, I don't think this would be possible. And these therapies are the therapies of the future. These are therapies that will cure things like muscular dystrophy, macular degeneration, and other diseases. And you really have to start thinking about how do we get these patients into studies, and these types of technologies are going to be really critical to that next generation of drugs.
So one piece, of course, that part of the theme tonight was sort of AI. If you don't have a company with AI or blockchain in the name, don't even start. But now the challenge, of course, is now this exponential sets of data. That doesn't mean it's actual insights. So I don't know if you're seeing from the big pharma side or the incubator side, how do you start managing this massive elements to really make sense of it and maybe gain new insights that then lead to a regulatory approval or maybe even directing the drug to a totally new target?
Sure.
So one of the things that we started to do, because we in Novartis, we have like a lot of data. So it's really big data sets that at certain point with the new CEO coming on board, he was like, okay, what can we do with those? So one of the things that we are doing in BIOME is actually we are creating those sandboxes that are allowing startups to come and work with us. So on actually trying to understand what can we do with those data, especially it is not a single effort that, for example, Novartis will invest and we will do it. It has to be an open crowdsourcing to understand or getting those type of, for example, giving to Medable, this customized sandboxes for them to be able to work together on like the genome program, which we are doing in BIOME. And at the same time, looking at all other ideas and other technology which is available today in the market, and trying to customize those data sets for them to make sense for us. So I believe from a pharma point of view, we cannot do this alone. So it's very important to start to be democratizing data and to start to share it openly without the expectation that we would be able to do it ourselves, which it was the traditional way of how pharma works.
Mm-hmm.
I think just kind of taking a step back, the way most pharma companies are structured these days are your data sits in all these silos. So you have your R&D data, which never talks to the clinical trial data, which never talks to the actual commercial data of who's prescribing your drug in the real world. And that doesn't talk to how the patients are adherent on your data and which types of patient populations are better likely to be on your drug and to maintain the adherence. I think that there is a recognition finally between most pharma companies. I know it's happening in Novartis. I know it's happening in Sanofi, that you can't just do anything unless all of this is a seamless data set. And because you can't intervene, because the moment the patient leaves a trial, the patient has gone into the real world and you can't track that patient anymore. So I think there is a conscious effort in all of these big pharma companies to create a common infrastructure first and foremost, to actually be able to integrate these data sets and combine. And by the way, there's plenty of data, right? Between all these data sets, there's so much data, but the problem being that none of these data sets are connected. So I think finally, when you see that seamless integration, you can actually think about a patient enrolling in a trial, really staying on the clinical trial, then going into the real world when the drug is approved, and you track that patient as an N of one, as a personal patient, as whatever, and a separate identity, right? And that's when you start running the real analytics and start getting real-time data on how your patient interacts with that particular medication and what that means for outcomes and treatment of the disease.
So can I ask a question? Because that's what we do, right? We track that patient longitudinally. How much of that makes it back to you? How much can you see?
Yeah, that's a fair question. So everything so technically, a pharma company can see all of that data without knowing who that patient is, right? So as long as the patient has a unique identifier and the sponsor of the trial doesn't know it's Ruchita, Sinha, who's that patient X, right? You can track all of that information.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe a note for most of the audience. It doesn't mean that actually we can know your data. This is very important. As a pharma company, what Ruchita was highlighting from unidentified data, it means that there's no single possibility there's no way that we'll be able to identify who is the patient. But I mean, here we are talking about the personas, like this type of disease or this type of patient. We'll be able to track him from a clinical trial till, for example, when he starts to take the drugs. The problem in our case that we cannot identify, for example, the ethnicity of the patient. We cannot do this, but the whole point that we are trying to look at the whole journey of a patient to try to learn and to start to customize our products according to this. So
yeah, important point to correct that
exactly.
Pharma companies cannot identify who you are.
Yeah, there's no way. There's even if you want.
Legally or
technically? And technically as well.
Both. So compliance, the pharma companies have very compliance standards that they cannot identify their patients on their drugs.
So we cannot know anything about our patient in clinical trials, even if we are sponsoring this clinical trial. It's,
So if you learn something in your research that could help the patient, there's no way you can let it out.
no.
Does that seem wrong?
This is the regulation, the way that we are looking at patients from a regulatory point of view. We cannot actually, because they are, maybe some other companies will use it in the wrong way. So in this case, the best way is report back to the community. So any data, if we see something wrong, we report it back. So we have this something called pharmacovigilance, which is we technically report to FDA and report to all the regulatory, it depends on the country. Anything which is, like as you were highlighting, that we believe, even if it's against our drug, we actually report it back on in 24-hour basis. So
I think the key point to your question being, the pharma companies rely on the physicians to be the care provider and make treatment decisions. The pharma company cannot make treatment decisions. So if something goes wrong with that particular therapy, it actually is on the physician to change the course of treatment.
So it seems like a lot of the regulatory privacy laws, et cetera, need to adapt in this new age and let people opt in, whether it's with blockchain technologies or whatever. One theme of this future of clinical trials is convergence and new data sets. So before I jump to sort of the audience questions, like maybe Michelle, are you seeing new things that are being integrated in your Amazon Alexa voice elements, listening to your cough, which was in the news about Amazon potentially patenting listening to your voice or a cough to pick up neurologic or other changes? And what do you think the role and partnerships might be with Apple's and Amazon's and other consumer players are coming into the mix?
Sure. So, I was mentioning earlier, we're building this concept called the digitome, so this digital representation of health and disease, and we think that, where the clues lie may really surprise us. So we're capturing a lot of data from the way we configure our text messages or emails or even, faces, images, anything you can imagine. But I'd say, so it will be kind of to be determined in terms of each disease and where some of the insights may lie. Partnerships, I think, are really, really important. We've been lucky to partner with some of the leading consumer technology companies. They've helped us on our product. They've helped us on the market. We're really excited partnering with the Novartis BIOME, which I think in the world of data sets is a company in Silicon Valley. We can integrate with APIs from Alexa to, you name it, and wearable consumer devices. But what we don't have access to are the pharma de-identified data sets. And I think the partnership and what Novartis is actually doing with the BIOME is incredibly revolutionary, because it's saying, how does this all come together? And let's leverage technology companies to help provide the insights, and we'll provide this very valuable data set, and together we can do more. So I believe that it's not just about the data, but it's about the real insights that we can derive from it, and partnering around what types of data are going to drive that, the clinical trial data, the consumer data, all being really important. So we're looking forward to telling more of that story within the next year as we launch this Human Digitome project.
But a couple questions coming in about the EMR and how to, given that many sites don't want to integrate with EMRs, how are we getting around that element? So how do you potentially work with healthcare management software elements? And then a question related to this for Deep 6, how do you validate your technologies? Have you done any peer-reviewed trials? How do you sort of show that this is effective?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's different types of validation, right? I mean, when we talk to data scientists, people always ask us about precision and recall. And we can talk about that forever, but honestly, it really defeats the purpose. The end goal of what we do is to try to find every patient that's potentially eligible for a trial. So what we do is we really focus on recall. If there's 100 patients in your system that are eligible for a trial, we will find those 100. If that means that we return 120 patients just to make sure we have those 100, we will do that. Our bigger thing is to be robust for those 20 that may not be in there. So how we validate it, I mean, there's an art and a science to recruiting for clinical trials. We can only find patients on the data that's in the system. If data is missing, say if you need to have a PSA doubling value for a certain patient, put them on a trial, that's a sparse data point. Most physicians don't calculate that for all the patients, so you're not going to have that. So you have to have the ability, the flexibility, say, I'm going to mute this. Don't look at this, because otherwise all the patients that don't have it, but that would have the value, just not recorded, would be excluded. So there's some of that trial and error. So what we really do is we try to be as robust as possible for those kind of omissions. Either the data isn't there, or we're going to make sure that this patient, he meets 9 out of the 10 criteria, but I still want to be able to see that patient, because maybe over time this will change and that patient becomes eligible. So it's more a question of how do you deal with patients that are borderline? How do you validate them and keep them kind of somewhere on your radar, not really there? How do you have like descending buckets of eligibility that you can kind of track to get everybody on there? What we've done, we've partnered with a couple of physicians. We did a couple of studies around that. We actually had an oncologist from Cedars-Sinai who presented at HIMSS earlier this year. And she had a talk which I thought was awesome, also because it was about us. But it was called The ROI of AI. And she spoke about 79 retrospective studies that they had done where she compared how they did it before and how they did it with us. And she used a couple of criteria. And now I want to kick myself for not remembering all of them, but the key things were accuracy. How many patients did we find that she had found before, et cetera. And I think we had a 120% increase over the patients that they had found on average over studies, which was pretty good, because some of them were rare. And we saved on average, I think, 208 hours per study in the time to actually find the patient. So I can point people to that if they want to see that. It's still anecdotal, right? What we do when we go to a site, we always have a dedicated customer success person who goes and who basically tracks across this whole model that we build how many trials that you used to do, because you don't know whether you would have patients for it or not, can you avoid by using our technology. So how many trials you would have started, wasted a couple of resources on, then, oh, I don't have patients, could you avoid? So that's one thing we measure. Over 12 months, we measure these 8 or 9 different variables that all tie into that ROI, that success story, and then we share that with the site. And our idea is for them to publish that and then bring it out.
I think the EMR is a really big topic, and Wout and I have actually talked about this. What's awesome is that EMR data is becoming decentralized and patient-owned, and that's really important. And I think the work that Apple's doing to enable the EMR data to go into HealthKit is really important. And I think ultimately I see a world where everything's going to center around the patient. The patient's going to own their data. They're going to govern their data. They're going to govern access to their data. I think that's really important because there have been a lot of talk over the last couple of years about interoperability. In the United States, we have one major player who's Epic. And frankly, as a small company, working with Epic from a business perspective is impossible. I actually think there should be like some sort of startup coup because they really look to charge companies like ours something like $5,000 a patient. And it's like, it's impossible.
Epic fail.
Yeah, it's really actually, I think it's a humanitarian crisis because it really defeats a lot of the interoperability. The cool and great thing is that the patients seem to be winning. While small companies like ours may not have the best route in as a B2B play, the patients are winning and the patients are going to win. So it's those who partner with the patients that I think are going to win in the big picture of interoperability because I'm really hopeful that that's who's going to own the data in the next couple of years.
And the empowered patients can sometimes start to create their own trials. I've seen there's a platform called Chronology, patients with Crohn's, and they design their own trials. Does beer drinking hurt your Crohn's disease? And apparently it does, but Anheuser-Busch was not going to sponsor that trial.
Right.
There's patients like me that's out there, et cetera. So part of the future may be you may almost have too many trial options. How are you going to decide if you've got, I don't know, lupus or some other disease, and maybe it gets more segmented, which one to try?
Track outcomes, right? The key thing is always, you can talk about eligibility for trials, and there's so many trials out there exactly. For some immunotherapy drugs right now, in oncology, there's more trials than there are patients. So it's really hard. But if you can track outcomes on the patients that you have, then it should become like, what is the most beneficial trial for my patients?
Yeah, that, and also I think for natural history studies, one thing that we're really trying to push on is multi-sponsor registry. So why have 10 different pools of patients with the same illness? Yep. Let's have 10 different sponsors being able to capture data from that same group of patients and make it patient-directed. So I think that, again, kind of coming back to patient, I love Wout's idea, when we think of adaptive, maybe you're not performing well on this trial, so let's get you into this other trial faster because we have real-time data on how you're performing.
Maybe one more thing, something that you said, actually resonated with me when you say, in other countries, you don't have the same robustness of data. We don't have genomic information, right? Another thing you could do is, can I actually use the data that I have for certain patients and say, you know what, this patient, say in Morocco, right, has all the phenotypic expressions that make me believe that he's very likely or very probable to have the genetic mutation. Based on other data, patients like him typically have one of these two mutations. Yeah. Can I use it to actually advance this patient for screening and then enroll them?
I think you're completely right. And one more thing that actually, as Michelle and you were highlighting, that actually patients are winning at the end of the day. So in the future, it will be exactly the same when you are choosing between different health apps or like games or whatever. You will choose actually your clinical trial according to how good or how best is the way it's actually presented from a UI perspective, from the way actually the investigator actually did effort to explain what is the value of this trial and why it's important for me. So in the future, it will be with those high number of clinical trials that will be available for every single patient. Patient will win by choosing the best one that fits him according to all the input that actually the clinical trial team actually put in the app. So it will be exactly the same why you choose this specific app and not this one, despite there's tons of the same app doing the same thing.
And you need to communicate. The user interface, design thinking is not yet much involved in trials.
Exactly.
How you communicate to a 17-year-old with type 1 diabetes versus a 70 needs a very different flavor. Also, language, culture, education. So you mentioned earlier that a lot of things are moving offshore from the U.S. Are you seeing some blended models? And what trials can be done outside of the U.S. now that might leapfrog back?
To be honest, no. So still US market is the most advanced one, and the highest one with an appetite to try and test. So from transparency, no, actually, I think the answer is no. However, I believe it's the same like when Waze came with like the whole new way of looking at the traffic. There will be some ideas that it will come very customized according to nations or markets, that in the future it will come back to US, and actually it will impact the whole ecosystem as well. And I think we have a role as more of a global companies to start sharing and creating this connection. So one of the things that we are planning to do in BIOME is creating the different centers worldwide, which it will start to talk to each other, sharing those type of experience, hoping that some ideas will come from Morocco, maybe that, or Tel Aviv, that actually will come back here, which can actually disrupt the whole industry, making us look at stuff in completely different ways that we use today.
And a
I
lot of
think in a lot of ways there is slightly a reverse problem where 85% of clinical trials are global, and so but all the innovation is happening in the U.S. And you think about, well, how do I roll this out in my entire trial when the company and the technology is in the U.S., right? I want to be able to roll this out across all my centers, across all the countries. So I think there is a conscious effort by the sponsors of these trials to take these technologies and replicate them, and they're trying to do that. In some areas, geographies like Europe, they are making advances where there's an initiative called IMI, or I forget the exact name for it, but where it's a consortium of leading hospitals that have come together to be able to share data and be able to create the clinical trials hub. But not necessarily in all geographies. I mean, I think there's the CFDA is finally falling in line with the FDA, so I think it's a step in how you do things in China, which used to be the wild, wild east, right? So I think things are falling in line, but a lot of the innovation is still very focused in the US.
One thing I'll make a side note, because I have a friend in the audience who works at Medable, Tyler Pugsley, who somehow has iPads on a clinical trial being delivered to 40 countries. And I'm just like, somehow we found a way to make this happen. But I think it was the first time this has actually ever happened. When you think about, especially putting things in the hands of patients, has to be translated to all the local languages. How do you really do this? But the cool thing is, I think the key thing is with partnerships, you actually have the ability to start to execute on this, but it really requires tight partnerships between the tech companies doing the trials, the tech companies who provide the hardware, companies you may not even expect who are doing mobile device management. And everyone really has to be focused on the value around what this can do for humanity in terms of advancing medical care. It's pretty interesting times from that perspective.
And the largest markets are not in the US, and lots of markets are opening up with access to internet, drones for delivery.
Right.
So a lot of investors in the audience potentially, and maybe over to you for a bit. What do you see in terms of the shifting landscape on investing in companies that relate to clinical trials? And maybe for the entire panel, what are some pain points and areas that are still open areas for entrepreneurs to get into? And many of the entrepreneurs coming to this are not traditional healthcare folks.
Yeah, I think that kind of the numbers speak for itself, right? So they say about 80% of the clinical trials are running late, right? And if you talk about a blockbuster drug, which is a drug that is projected to make $1 billion plus in revenues at peak, I think the number is the pharma companies are losing $8 million per day that the trial is delayed. So there are big numbers that we're talking here. The total cost that it takes, I think the last number I saw to actually develop a drug from beginning to the end is $2.6 billion, right? So if you think about even one average study, and the $2.6 billion is spread out over R&D, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, obviously. Any one trial, let's say the range is 100 to 500 million, right, that they are spending on the trial, 30% of that is going to patient recruitment, right? And that is the single biggest pain point, because that's why the trial times are getting longer and the costs are getting higher for these trials, is because people just can't find patients. And so that's an area I would encourage anybody to come, because it's real dollars we're talking, and it's a massive pain point for any pharma company. So that nut, even though when you look at the landscape, that it's so crowded, but that nut hasn't quite been cracked yet. And a lot of the problems don't necessarily lie in being able to educate patients and bring them by social media. It lies in everything that happens after that, being able to make sure your patients are eligible and being able to connect that patient to the right PI. And it's a lot of operational stuff, but that's what you need to do to actually capture that share of the market. The other piece I would talk about is more the back-end side of the data management and the analytics piece. That piece, there are some incumbents in the space, but they're, again, very similar to EMR's lack of interoperability. And so there is opportunity there for people to come in and think about how do you integrate the data collection, the monitoring of the patients, and then the post-study analytics and report outs on clinical metrics. So that would be another pain point if you ask some of the incumbents in the space. And then new models of running clinical trials, whether it be pop-up trials or adaptive trials. I think the FDA has shown openness to discussing these types of trials. So it's not necessarily that big of a regulatory risk as much. So I think there's opportunity to just kind of think out the box of, if you aren't from that space, from the world of clinical trials, how would you run a clinical trial, and how would you make sure you're learning along the way, right? And you're making it better, faster, cheaper. So decentralized trial is an example. Decentralized or siteless trial is an example. Pop-up trials are examples. But these are clearly examples of creative ideas that entrepreneurs have thought about in the space.
So we've only got about 10 minutes left, so I thought we'd sort of riff to the not-so-distant future. Let's say it's a decade from now. Lots just happened even in the last decade. There's a famous quote from Bill Gates: we overestimate what will happen in a year and underestimate what will happen in a decade. And it's only been about 10, 11 years since the iPhone launched, Twitter launched, Airbnb is only 10 years old. You know, these are examples that are pretty common. They've shifted many areas. If we were to jump forward to 2028, and we're back in this room, let's maybe imagine what could be out there, maybe on your own platforms or others. Am I going to log into Facebook, if it still exists, and have my Facebook pop up, tell me I'm eligible for a trial, and will Amazon drop off by drone my trial in a kit? And will my chatbot be coaching me through my follow-up? I mean, those are all sort of convergent examples that could come together. Any sort of visions you have for a decade out?
Well, after listening to you today, I feel like the whole adagium of saying the unexamined life is not worth living feels like everything will be examined, everything we will do, right? Across multiple sensors and data platforms, it'll all converge, etc. And every data point can lead to some kind of an abstraction and interpretation for our health. Whether it's the tone in which we write an email, or you're stressed, or you're this or that, right? Everything can come together, and someone make a recommendation that can either be on the clinical side, or it could be in a clinical trial. As I mentioned before, I believe trials and treatment will somehow converge and exist side by side. You will have options to choose from. So if I think about 10 years from now, I believe, yes, patients will be a lot more enabled, hopefully, and maybe through different technologies. It may be like an Ethereum-like smart contract to own their own data. They will have the ability to collect their data and then basically use it and distribute it to those parties which they believe will benefit them, either to recommend care or monetize it, or trials, etc. And I believe you'll have the convergence of data, not just clinical data, what we're talking about today, but maybe even lifestyle data. So you know, this patient, since I know Wout is a lazy bastard, he's never going to show up for his trial, or he's never going to stick with it, or whatever, right? So you look at more than just the traditionally clinical stuff, you look at interpretations, and you have a much wider sense, and you can actually personalize it even more to personality traits, etc.
Yeah, I mean, your credit card company already knows that about you. I mean, how do you charge?
Everybody knows that about us. I wish it was just my credit card company.
So there's a lot of sort of Black Mirror kind of ethical challenges here too, because you may learn something about, 10 years from now we'll have a $10 genome, or it'll be free.
Yep.
And that gives you a lot of challenges with employment, with insurance, and also one of the insurance companies last month announced that only if you're going to wear a wearable and you're doing your steps are you going to have a good premium. So there might be risks to joining certain trials if data is used inappropriately. Sorry, Michelle.
Sure. So, part of our effort is on this digitization of data. And it's interesting as we're bringing in this massive data and creating these representations, kind of had this realization that, disease has long existed in a binary state. We either do or we do not have a disease. And I think in 10 years, instead, we will shift to a model that's not about disease, but it's about homeostasis. And it's about detecting when there's a deviation in homeostasis at an individual basis. And we will think about drugs not as targeting diseases, but as combination of treatments that will realign homeostasis in a given individual. So that's my hope. I think it could, help us shift to a world where we're detecting earlier and where therapies are used in combination much more intelligently.
Just to riff on that a second, if you think about it, we want to move from sick care to healthcare to being proactive and preventative.
Right.
We probably are all going to be we could potentially all be running our own clinical trial because it's really based on your baseline, which is different.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And when it shifts, so if your mattress detects your resting heart rate's going from 55 to 70, something's going on. If your voice change is picked up by your phone,
Right.
All those things might be you might be always opting into a trial about yourself and then being offered potentially new therapies or existing ones for prevention or.
It's the panopticon, right? In a way, you have everybody's eyes are on you all the time, all of your sensors, and they'll tell you what to do. It's like David Hume with the panopticon or Foucault. I think it has some risks as well, but probably this is not the forum to go into that.
Yeah. So besides, actually, I doubt that Facebook will stay 10 years. And one thing that actually I believe that there will be a big integration between the social and the health data. Those would be very linked together. So the way we are looking at clinical trial now, that you have to subscribe to join a specific clinical trial, this will not be anymore. There will be a continuous data monitoring for everything that you are doing from a social and from a health, which it will be linked even to your drug because everything will be personalized, very customized according to your need. So it is not about anymore that you need to create a drug by actually collecting those data. Everything, it would be like, I would say it's a closed loop that with all the data that you are collecting in your life, as you said, from work, from your tone, from everything, from even the food you ordered, there will be automatic data collection, which it would be linked to a much bigger database from a continuous analysis from platforms like yours and even from Google and all of the future Googles. And those will create kind of suggestions and prediction for maybe that because you ordered this food today, you need to take something in the future. And it automatically your data would be grouped in a different group who actually decided to eat more bacon in the morning. And those will be creating kind of a future study trying to predict what type of beer they need to take or drink. So all of those will be continuous and will be not linked to specific time bound. It's kind of like everything continuous with your data that everyone will be the same like the traffic that you were highlighting from Google. Yeah.
And part of our traffic adapts as we go. One of the challenges with a clinician today, if I see you in the patient, usually you have high cholesterol, pick the same 40 milligrams of Lipitor, I should theoretically get a dashboard of real-time, just up-to-date information that's sort of this global clinical trial that will inform your selection.
Exactly.
It's a lot of barriers to get to there, but it's been done in small ways at Stanford and beyond.
Again, I think everything has already been said, but I'll probably summarize it as 4 things. So I think really the patient being the most at the center of the treatment and the healthcare industry as a whole, but the patient being the more educated and in control of their health. The patient owning all of their data and deciding how to use it, including what types of clinical trials to go to. The third would probably be, I think what you said would be more adaptive and continuous trials that self-learns. I think the self-learning part is really important. And then the last piece, which I don't think we've touched on today, is the patient deciding between drugs and software as a medicine. So one of the themes we haven't talked about is software as a medicine, which I'm a big believer in, and the patient being able to choose between should I take drugs or should I actually use some other method to treat my.
Right, because we'll probably be prescribed a drug and that digital wrapper around it, which has other regulatory and trial
Or it
elements.
could be a digital drug.
Right.
There doesn't need to be a pharmaceutical agent altogether.
Right, and some have been approved digital drugs for tinnitus, for pregnancy prevention. Any other favorite therapeutics?
Well, I mean, if you look at Pear Therapeutics, they have an FDA-approved drug for substance abuse, which is a software-only drug that physicians can prescribe. So, and they have a commercial partnership with a large pharma company to actually distribute it like a drug.
There's virtual reality simulations that help you actually combat pain, and they're supposed to be opioid substitutes.
Right, VR is therapy.
Yeah.
All right, 20-second pass. Any closing words and thoughts for everybody here if they want to get involved? Any asks, any suggestions? And then we'll turn it over to close it out.
Start with Ruchita for a change, so I can think about something.
Any asks of the audience?
Asks or suggestions, or any kind of wrapping 20 seconds?
Please think out of the box in a complex industry like this, because as we've discussed, there's clearly a whole lot of inefficiency so in this particular area. So tons of opportunities for entrepreneurs as well as investors.
Yeah, I think.
And to give me a call.
Sure. So she has the money, so give her a call. But one thing which is I need to highlight that actually this field, which is a clinical trials, it was not disrupted since maybe 40 or even more years. So I believe there is a need for Uber and Google and all of those for clinical trials. So there are some starting points like Medable and Deep Six, but like we really need more ideas. The recruitment part is huge. You cannot imagine how big it is. And really think out of the box. I really want to echo this, and this is the focus for any pharma company, by the way.
So I think thanks everyone for being interested in the topic. It is really, really important to us all, curing human disease. You imagine today if you're diagnosed with ALS or really, any condition, it's too long. 12 years is too long. We need technologies that are going to radically change this to far shorter timeframes. It's not lack of compounds, it's lack of effective process. So thanks everyone for coming. We're based in Palo Alto, so if anyone wants to come by our office or learn more about what we're doing in clinical trials, just sync up with us here this evening.
Yeah, no, I'm at the other end of the line, so I'm going to say everything has been said, but I completely agree. For all of the smart people in this room and the people that have a talent, they can choose what to do with that talent and those smarts. Consider this: if you can help solve the problem of clinical trials, you're really helping accelerate innovation in healthcare as a whole. It's a very holistic, very meta approach to healthcare, and it has tremendous benefits. You're really bringing life-saving cures to patients faster, and you're helping the current state of knowledge, which has an exponential effect on the future. So reach out to all of us, I would say. If you're looking to join this fight, yeah, we're all looking for smart people to join us.
Great. Well, I want to thank the panel. Thanks, VLab. We're right up to 10:30. Thanks very much.